To be able to make the main top armour, what I did was I took the mock-up that I made before of the under armour. This is the exact same top that I patterned in the under armour tutorial. To be able to pattern over this, I need to close the back, so I use some duct tape just to close the foam armour together. What I then do is cover the whole of the chest part with tin foil. It means I can put duct tape over this, so I can draw on new seams for my chest part of my armour. For the bottom part of the top, all I did was I took my base pattern. I added 2.5mm on each side to make it wider. I cut that out by hand and glued it together. This gave me the perfect size for the bottom of my top, with the seams basically in the same place. Once the chest part was covered with duct tape, I then patch on the bottom piece and then I draw new seams for the chest part. I felt it was better to re-pattern the chest part. This is because there's curves involved and the shape can change heavily. It's a lot quicker than trying to resize the pattern that you have already if there's curves involved. Just remember to add reference points to every seam on the pattern before removing. As with my under armour, I take all the foil off and cut it into parts, making sure I label them. In this case, I use a similar labelling system, but add an O for outer. If they don't lay flat, I just cut a little slit into the pattern. If I put my original pattern over this, you can see why I've repatterned it. The shape is completely different. Once I've cut my pattern out, I then cut in the registration marks. As I did with the under armour, I then transfer it to butcher paper. I use a flexible ruler to draw in any curves with the Sharpie, and for any straight lines I use a steel rule. I ensure that I add the registration marks and label the pattern. I then cut all the pattern pieces with an X-Acto knife. As always, try to control the cut and to cut it in one full movement where possible. Now that the pattern was ready, I could make the base top. As with the under armour, I use 5mm foam for this. I take my long thin silk pins and I use these to arrange the pattern on top of the foam. I use these pins as they are much finer than regular pins and don't leave any noticeable holes in the foam. I then draw around the pattern with a silver pen so I could see it clearly. Once finished, we can remove the pattern. And I do this for every single part. Just as a side note, remember to do the reverse so that you've got two identical pieces, one for the right side and one for the left side of the top. Also remember to label everything. To cut out the foam pieces, I use a box cutter knife. I use this because it's quite sharp and it has a longer blade on it. Again, when cutting, I try not to flex my wrist too much. If you're not used to cutting foam in this way, I do suggest you practice, as a good cut can make all the difference. When you're cutting the foam, remember to do it at 90 degrees. This means that when you go to glue the pieces together, they will sit flush with each other. Make sure you cut out any darts that you've added, however do not cut the registration marks as they are just a guide for gluing. A trick for cutting curves or circles like this is to turn the foam whilst you cut. Also try to cut in one movement. A sharp knife should glide through the foam without hesitation. Always make sure your knife is sharp during these cuts. I sharpen mine after every couple of cuts. Once all the foam pieces were cut, I could then glue them together. I put contact cement on each surface that's to be glued and spread the glue. I suggest starting with parts A and B. The glue can take a short amount of time to dry, so you can try gluing different areas at once. I then use a heat gun to shape the foam. This helps to guide it into the right shape and it stops the glue wanting to pull apart in tricky areas. You might need to really curve it round like this to get the shape you want as it bounces back. Firstly, I glue part A to part B, making sure that the registration marks line up. Sometimes you need to fight a bit with the foam, but this really is the main rule. Just make sure your registration marks line up. I take part C and glue the darts together. Then I glue part C to part B, using the heat gun to add shape first and make gluing easier. I then take my circle and glue that on. I didn't use registration marks for the circle, all I did was glue it as is, making sure not to stretch it when I glued. I add heat, however I do not heat the circle. I do not want to misshape this circle, so I only heat part C. Bear in mind that I did actually change some of this top, so you might find that your pattern's slightly different from my pattern, but the pattern that I've given you is the one that you should use. I glue part E to part C, again making sure the registration marks line up. Once this half of the main top was complete, I then just repeated it on the other side. Now I'm going to glue these together using the contact cement. I just wait till the glue is not tacky and then join those together using the registration marks. If at any point you find this hard to glue, just grab your heat gun and it should help guide them into place. Next I work on the back. I add glue to the surfaces to get joined together, wait till the glue's not tacky, use the heat gun to help shape and then join those together. As always, just pay attention to those registration marks. Lastly, I join the back to the front. I need to join them up with the side seam and with the seam above the shoulder. As a side note, once this is glued, please try it on with your under armour. Before adding any detail at all to this top, you really want it to fit perfectly. Because I'm adding detail over this, I want everything to be as smooth as possible, and if there's excess glue there, then that's not going to happen. All I do is I take Evo Stick adhesive cleaner, add it to a cloth, and then slowly rub it on where there's any glue spots. Once I feel like I've cleaned off the glue, I refine the shape a bit more. After heating the surface, I take a large acrylic dome and mould the chest shape around it. Now the main thing that will show up under the detail is any seams, because the seams won't lay flat right away. If you run your finger along this, you'll probably know what I mean. So all we're going to do here is remove material. You can do this with a Dremel. I've used a stone bit for mine as it's less abrasive than a sanding drum, however you can use either. And you can do this with wet and dry paper. If you've got quite a bit of material to get removed, the Dremel is excellent and will remove it quickly. However, the wet and dry paper will help you just finish that off really nicely. If you're ever unsure if it's smooth, just run your finger over it. If you can still feel a ridge, then it's not smooth. I use this method for every seam on the top until I'm happy with the smoothness. Then I grab a cloth and clean off any of the remnants of where I've been sanding. Another thing that might happen is there might be gaps. To fill these, I use decorator's caulk and a wooden sculpting knife. I spread it onto any gaps that are showing and then brush off any excess with the knife. To help smooth it out, I dip my finger in some water and run my finger over the whole of the caulk. Using water in this way just kind of feathers it out. When I was finished, this is what it looked like. Now obviously I designed all my files for the detail, but then I had to work it out first. So I made a few different models trying to work out where all the patterns should be. Luckily I've worked all this out for you. I took any files that I'd patterned and transferred them to a free software called Inkscape, where I kept refining them until I was happy. For the first set of detail I'm cutting, I'm using 2mm foam. So what we do is we take some blue painter's tape and we tape it down to make sure it doesn't move about when it's getting cut. You also need to make sure you're using the correct blade. The Cricut basically will take your file and cut it out, as is. One thing you'll notice is that sometimes the foam comes up from the base. You really need to be present throughout the whole cut and you need to make sure that nothing is coming up off of the board. You can pause your cut at any time and fix anything like that. When using the knife blade, Design Space sets it to cut 14 times, which takes ages, and it can cause problems. You only need to let it do 2 or 3 passes, so I suggest to pause and eject the cut early. So once our cut's finished, this is what we've got here. You can see the edge finish on this is excellent, which is why I decided to machine cut the detail in the first place. So the first part I'm going to work on is the collar. This is foam part T1. Instead of using the Cricut, I hand cut the collar out of 5mm foam. You can actually create this template by card or something like that. So transfer the pattern onto the 5mm foam and then cut that out with a box cutter knife or similar. It's so important to keep your knife sharp. This is my knife sharpener and I use it frequently. I've also created this template here. This is basically to mark out where I'm dremeling because I'm going to bevel the front of the collar. Having a pattern like this means that when it's reversed it will look exactly the same as the other side. Then what I do is I take some frog tape, or you can use something like painter's tape, and I put the tape right along the line that I've just marked in. The reason I've done this is I don't want to dremel too much, and this will give me a guide of where to stop. Before dremeling, it's a good idea to remove as much material as you can with a knife. This saves a lot of time and it saves a lot of effort. You can see when I'm cutting it, it is really rough looking, but we will be smoothing that out with the Dremel. Now we have less material to work with, we can go in with the sanding drum on the Dremel. You can see I'm sanding this at an angle, and what I want to do is not remove any foam from the very bottom of this collar. You don't want it to lose its shape at all. Once that was done, I decided to bevel the back of this. I have actually created a pattern for you for this part. In the same way, I removed the excess material and then I Dremel it to give a nice bevel. Once I'd finished that, you can see this is what it looked like. The only issue was this middle part here. So what I did was I turned the Dremel a different way, just to get into that little nook there. Once you've finished Dremeling, you can use some wet and dry paper just to smooth it out that little bit more and to finish it off. When the collar is finished, it should look like this. Next, I mark on the top where it is to go. You can use the middle seam on the collar as a guide. Then I add contact cement to the top, contact cement to the collar, and I glue those together. We have other parts of the collar to glue on. However, there is a slight gap underneath. So as always, when I have a gap underneath that I need to support, I add some foam clay. Next, I'm taking file T2. I need to remove some material from the curved part of T2 so that when it's glued to the base there's no visible seam. To do that, I make a cut with my knife at 45 degrees. I then Dremel it down. I then wet sand it down further. The very top edge of T2 should feel paper thin. You will need a centre line for T2. Next, I'm going to glue that on, and you can use the middle seam line as a guide. I use contact cement on both surfaces to join these together. So if I feel the join of where T2 meets the base top, there is a ridge. So what I'm going to do is add some foam clay along it. And this will help hide that seam, so when complete the join will feel smooth and unnoticeable underneath all the detail. So now you can leave this to dry overnight with the collar foam clay on and the part of T2 at the top. Once these are dry, you can sand them. I keep sanding until I'm happy with the smoothness here. You should be able to run your finger right along it and not feel a ridge. If I lay the part T3 along this, I need to make sure that this is glued on the same place on both sides. So I've added some registration marks at the side here, and these should line up with the seams underneath. I mark this on both sides. Then what I do is draw around where I have to glue. This will give me a guide of where the contact cement goes. I add contact cement to T3 and to the top. Once they're set, I then glue. You need to be careful when you're lining this up. Make sure it is flush to that middle seam line, and then it should match up with all the marks that you've just drawn on the top. Also make sure that these outer edges sit flush to that line. There's a lot of detail that's going to be going around this armhole, and we want it to look like a nice curve once it's finished. Once I'm happy with that, I then glue the other side. As a reminder, if you need to use baking paper to line this up, it can actually be quite helpful. I would take your time on this part, because every other part that gets glued on after this is a result of what you've just glued. So make sure it's symmetrical and make sure it's in the right place. Next, I cut part T4. The long part of T4 gets glued right along the top of T3 here, and it comes down in the middle. Just make sure it's flush to that seam line in the middle. The larger part of T4 gets glued just across to the divide next to it. And the smallest piece of T4 goes in between these two. I then repeat this on the other side, and this is what we end up with. You can see it's really messy, but we will be cleaning that up later. Now I take part T5. I glue it flush to T3. T6 goes around the armhole, so you can either add that now or later. We take the rectangular part of T5. It gets glued right in this gap here. Again, I'm using contact cement on both surfaces, Remember to wait till the glue is not tacky before you glue things down. Also, as a reminder, spread the glue really thinly and it will glue a lot better. Next, I'm making part T7. You can see I've added a mark to this, roughly 12 centimeters along from the end, and then I've put markings on that end to remind myself that's the part I need to work on. I Dremel this in a way so that it bevels from 45 degrees at the very end to having no bevel at all at the white line I've marked on. This will be self-explanatory when you see how we're gluing this on. I can then glue T7 on. First of all, I transfer the 12 centimeter mark from T7 to the top. I take my contact cement and apply it to both surfaces. Make sure at this point you're not adding glue to the curved part of T7. Now to add the glue to this curve, I'm only putting some on the small beveled area that I've just Dremeled. I then apply glue to this edge of T5 so I can join them together at an angle. So basically I'm going to take the tapered edge here and this is where it gets glued. It gets glued at an angle upwards. So you can see this part's glued so that it's sticking up like this. There should be no glue underneath this part. This rectangular part at the end sits flat against the top. So your top should now look something like this. Next, I need to add in some support to this part, so I'm using foam clay. What I would do is add water to the surfaces where you're adding the foam clay and it helps it to stick a lot better. Then all I'm doing is packing it in. Once this top's complete, you won't see this foam clay. So it doesn't have to be absolutely perfect looking. What you do need to watch though is the angle that it's sticking up. So when you do both sides, they should both be of a similar height. This is the most important thing because you want both sides to be the same. Because we've just added foam clay, we do need to wait a day for it to dry, so we can move back up to the collar piece and finish that. I add glue to the collar part of the top and glue to T8, which I have cut out with the Cricut. I then take some baking paper to help me guide this part and I glue it onto the top. And then I do it on the other side. Afterwards, your top should look something like this at the collar. On top of that, we're going to glue T9. This is a thinner part in a similar shape, and it gets glued along the very top of T8. You will now need to let the foam clay under T7 dry overnight before starting the next step. Next, I'm taking part T10. This part gets glued at the very bottom of the top. I'm only applying glue to the little point that sticks down and then along the very base of the top. I leave out the curved part for now. Once set, I join those together. I apply glue just beside T7 and stop just before I reach the circle on the base top. You can see I've put a marking on the top where I want this to get glued. For this piece you want to sit it flush against the armhole and then glue straight along. Then we're left with this flappy bit here. So we can add glue to each edge now and join these together. Next I take T11. This gets glued from the armhole flush against T10. So for this next part, my main concern is that there's little domes getting put on top of this, but they need to sit higher. So what I did was I created a platform with foam clay. All I did was wet the surface, take the foam clay and just keep working it until it kind of raised that surface and went at the angle that I wanted. I actually used the steel rule just to pat it down and keep it as flat as possible. And I knew that eventually I was going to use a foam circle. This circle is part of T12. I use the circle as a guide to determine if the foam clay is at the correct angle, if I've added enough clay, and if it is flat. You can easily tell by laying it on top. When it's finished it looked like this, and then as always I leave it for a day to dry. In the meantime I went back to add in some extra detail. This is T13, and it goes on this main part of the top, just underneath that little ridge there. This part's actually made out of 1mm foam, so if you're using the Cricut to cut this, you'll need your deep point blade. I glue that on so it's flush with that edge. Next I'm taking little diamond pieces that go at the bottom. This is T14 and I have cut it in 2 different sizes. I just glue that straight into that little nook at the bottom. I now take the smaller diamond and I glue that on top of that. And you should end up with this shape here. Next I'm cutting T15. I've cut it out of 2mm foam and I'm layering it to get 4mm width. This slots in nicely at the sides here. And what I'm going to do is add some bevels to this. I Dremel everything apart from the bottom. Once they're glued on, it should look like this. Next we have parts T16, 17 and 18. I cut these from 1mm foam. These are little rectangles that I'm going to glue on top. When I'm finished, it looks a bit like this. I also Dremel the top. Next I cut T19. It's a long oval that gets put on top of the diamond shape. It's a bit tricky to do this, but I Dremel around the edges to make them rounder. You could always just use sandpaper for this. I then glue it directly in the middle at the bottom. I thought at this point it's a good idea to get started on the rivets. After trying out different methods, I decided to go down the foam clay route, but all I needed was a mould for them to go in, so I got this little one off eBay. I can only actually mould 2 at a time, so I had to redo this process a lot of times. However, they set really quickly, and I actually preferred when they hadn't fully set, because I could manipulate them just a little bit. I left these at least 10 minutes at a time before taking them out. To mark out the rivets, there should be 8 on this part here. All I did was I marked out where my first rivet was to go, where my last rivet was to go, and divide that distance by 7 and make markings. As a note, when you have small details like this, if they're not under a lot of tension, you can actually just add glue to one surface, it just takes longer to cure. So this is what I did for the rivets. I applied the glue to the top and then I pushed the rivet on. Because the rivets hadn't set completely when I glued them, it meant I could kind of push them down so it looked a bit more like they'd been hammered on. I continue to mark out where the rest of the rivets are to go, and I use the exact same methods for gluing throughout. You'll find that I'd gradually add the rivets throughout my project. It's because I could only mould 2 at a time, so it took a long time. Now I'm adding this 1mm detail at the top. This is file T20. This is made up of 3 parts and I glue them one at a time. I'd recommend gluing this longer part first, so add contact cement to the top and to this part and glue the 2 together. I then glue the main middle part, and I leave the bottom part for last. The reason I do that is because if there's any sort of issue with fitting it in, it's a lot easier to reshape that part than it is the other parts. Just a heads up that this was one of the most difficult things to glue, just because of the nature of the 1mm foam. I think I had to redo it at least once. Now the foam clay has set, so I'm moving back to part T12. It's made up of this long intricate shape and also the circle. So I add contact cement to the top and contact cement to this part and glue it all on. If you do find this part hard to glue at all, you could actually glue it in sections, so you could cut it up and things like that so it glues in a lot better. Or you could resize the part. This part's highly dependent on where all the other parts have been glued, so if there's anything different from mine, you might have to change that. So you can see on the circular part, I've actually marked out where I'm going to bevel it and then glue. I only want to bevel this in that area. So underneath the circle, I'm going to bevel that edge that I've marked out, so that when I lay it flat, it sits on top of T10. Once happy, I add contact cement over the foam clay, and along the edge of T10, I add the glue to the underneath of the circle and to the beveled edge. Next, I line that up and glue it on. The part I'm laying down now should be beveled underneath, and because we've beveled it at an angle, it should glue together really neatly with very minimal gaps. Now that all the top detail is complete, I just have to add the domes. For these, I'm using file D1. I cut the file out of 2mm foam on the Cricut. However, I also print it onto paper and remove that inner circle. This means I can clearly mark out where this circle is to be glued. And you want to do that step now because we will be shaping this and it won't be very easy to do later. To shape the dome, I use a heat gun. Then I take my 20cm acrylic dome. I put the foam piece into it and press it down with my hand. I kept applying pressure to it until it had cooled, then when I took it out it had this dome shape. Now obviously this is hollow underneath, so I'm going to fill it up with my foam clay. I add water to the surface of the foam underneath and then add in the foam clay. I put this small foam dome into my large acrylic dome, and I keep adding foam and pressing it down. To help with this process, I actually cut out some extra foam circles. And that means that I could press it down and I could see if there was enough foam clay in there and if I needed to add more. I felt it was helpful to often take it out and actually press it the other way round. This is a sort of balancing act because you don't want to add too much and you don't want to add too little. When you are adding the foam clay, just make sure it goes right up to the edge. You don't want any gaps near the edge. If it doesn't look neat, we're going to Dremel some of this away anyway. So what I do is I leave this foam clay to dry overnight. You want it to dry for about a day. Then the next day I glue on all my details. So the most important one that we're gluing is this circle that goes in the middle. If it does glue a couple of millimeters off, you're really not going to notice, so don't worry too much. Now we're going to glue on this detailed part. Before you glue this on, I want you to look at the front and the back of this. On one side there'll be visible cuts in the foam and it won't look as neat as the other side. From the way the Cricut cuts, the part of the foam that's face down will look the neatest. The one on the top is the messy one that you don't want to see. So all I do is apply glue to the dome, glue to the detail, and this part you'll need to really take your time. Just press it into the edges of that circle in the middle, and I actually use a steel rule just to help guide it. I then add glue to the perimeter, and I join those together. Afterwards, I use a heat gun again, and I put it into my acrylic dome and press down. This will ensure that everything's glued down properly, and that we have our nice dome shape with nothing sticking up. To neaten up the underside of my dome, I take a Dremel with a sanding drum on it, and I just run it around that bottom edge. This stops any of the foam clay being visible from the front. Now we can glue this on, so I add contact cement to the circle part of T12, contact cement to the bottom of D1, and then you'll really need to take care gluing this on. You really don't want to mess it up, as it'll not be easy to take that back off again. It should really be glued directly in the centre of that circle that's underneath. So once they were glued down, this is what they looked like. I'm going to be honest about my domes, I actually glued the wrong side of the detail part, so you might see that there's little cuts on mine. I actually fixed that later. If you haven't glued on T6 yet, I actually waited to the end to do mine, then do that now. I also want to point out that I added some back detail really last minute. It consists of 2 files, and one simply gets glued over the centre of the other one. I actually halved the design. So what I would do is see where the back of your zip ends up, and then cut this in a way that it matches where the zip ends. So once I'd finished, this is what it looked like overall. You can see there's visible glue still on here, so firstly I'm going to clean that off. So I take my Evo Stick adhesive cleaner and a cloth and I wipe that all off. Depending on how much glue you've got on here, it can take a bit of time. For these small areas, I actually use a cosmetic bud with the adhesive cleaner. This helps to get into all the nooks and crannies. So now I'm going to add on my zip. You might have already added yours on. First of all, you want to go inside the armour and add little cuts in all the way down with your knife. Next, you want to take your zip. I bought a heavy duty zip for this. First of all, I mark out where the zip is going to end on both sides. This will ensure they match up. Next, I'm going to use a hot glue gun. This is a bit tricky, so you might need to do it in sections. So add some glue to the inside of the armour, then push on your zip on top of that. Really be careful that the zip's not flush to the foam. You need a slightly small gap to be able to get the zip up. So make sure the zip has room to be pulled all the way up the top. I continue gluing the zip using the glue gun. Before moving to the other side, I just double check that this zip's going all the way up. Sometimes you might get the odd bit of glue poking out, you'll need to cut them off. Otherwise the zip might not make it all the way up to the top. So once I've glued the other side, I then go around the zip with the glue gun. This stops it peeling up at all. It's a really important step, so please do not miss this. So obviously I've still got the zips hanging off the top here, so I'm going to trim them to the length of the top. You can just do this with the regular scissors. Now the issue is that the zip can fly straight off of this thing. We need to create a stopper on the zip. To do this, I take a scrap of the zip that I've cut off. I then use pliers to push it into the zip that I've got here. Next, I take some wire cutters and I snip off the end of that part, so it looks a bit like this. I then get my soldering iron and I rub it across it. This melts the plastic together, creating the stopper. I do this for both sides. Now you can see when I go to zip the top, it stops. Next, I move on to make the shoulder panels. I designed these so that they're detachable from the top. I cut out files S1, S2 and S3. S1 and S3 are cut from 1mm foam, S2 is cut from 2mm foam. S2 goes on top of S1. So to join these, I'm using contact cement. I apply it to both surfaces. To join these two parts, I'm first of all lining up this part at the end here. Then what I think's a good idea is to join it at that little point that I've just done. Now push the rest of it down. The curves should line up now because we've got reference points glued on, and just flatten the whole thing. Now what we're doing is gluing S3 on top of that. However, I'm marking out where it's to get glued. The curved part should sit flush with the back, and at the front it's slightly shorter than S2. So I apply the contact cement, spread the glue, wait for it to set, and then line it up. I'm using baking paper because this part is really tricky, especially with 1mm foam. It tends to want to curl up when you're gluing. And then I pull the baking paper out and flatten it down, matching the curve underneath. Once that whole bit's flattened, I can then smooth down this part at the side here. I complete this for the other side, and this is what I have when I'm finished. I then heat the foam with a heat gun to shape it. Next, I'm working on part S4, and it replicates a fabric part that's underneath the shoulder armour. I'm writing where the top is because it's really easy to mess this up. The top should be the longer part of S4. So what I do is I find the centre line of it by measuring across in different places, creating dots and joining those dots. This centre line I've just drawn gives me a guide of where to glue the fabric. So this material under S4 is actually faux leather, and I've cut a little rectangle out of the bottom of it. This is a little bit tricky, so just follow these steps. The first thing is you'll put glue just around this area here, so all along the sides and the bottom of S4. Keep the middle top section free from glue. Now we add glue to the bottom of the leather. What to do next is just flip over the faux leather so that it glues to the foam. Next, on the back of the foam, we're covering it in glue. Then we're covering this part of the faux leather with the glue as well, missing out the sides. Once set, fold it over. Now we have these side sections that have to get glued. To make this easier, I remove some excess material. The main aim here is to make it look as neat as possible and not have any underside of the faux leather showing from the front. You want to hide all that. I also trim any excess from beside the foam here. Next, I go inside the faux leather, put some glue, and then I put some outside the faux leather at the side also. Doing this means the leather will stick to itself and also stick to the back here. I then repeat that for the other side. Now we move on to making the collar. I also made the collar detachable. I cut out parts C1 and C2. C1 I've cut out twice and I'm going to layer it to make it 4mm. I add contact cement to both surfaces and then join these together. Now we have a collar part that's 4mm width. Now I'm gluing on C2. This gets glued around the perimeter of C1. This is also quite tricky to glue. Use your baking paper. I would glue both ends first, then remove the middle. If you do need to bend it at all to glue, do it so that it's flush. Now I can shape this by heating it with a heat gun and curving it round. When it bounces back, it should have the right shape. Now I'm taking part C3. I've also cut this twice and I'm going to layer it. I add contact cement to both surfaces and join these together. As before, I glue both ends first, then remove the baking paper and smooth out the middle. So now I'm going to join both of these parts together. I Dremel at a 45-degree angle around the back. I then add contact cement to the top of C3 and contact cement around the bottom of my other piece. I can then join these together. I designed this in a way so that it sits underneath the top armour with some Velcro. However, you can implement it as a part of your main top if you wish. Okay, so at this point I looked into putting the shoulder armour over this, and I realised I had to remove some of the material. I take the shoulder armour and I try to work out where it should start and where it should stop. I then created this little part here, basically so that it raised the level and made it kind of similar to the height of the collar. All I did was carefully remove some material from the top with an X-Acto knife and then replace it with this part. I add contact cement to T24 and to the top and then just glue this on as a replacement. Next, I glue on my Velcro. I chose this method as I knew with enough of it on that it should hold the weight of the cape well. So I take the hook side of my Velcro and I draw around where I want it to go. I put it right at the front of this part. Then at the back of T24 I mark out for another piece of Velcro. I take my box cutter knife and score along where I've marked out for the Velcro. I then use a heat gun which opens up these scores. Now on the back here we need to make sure the back of the shoulder armour connects. So I've added 3 rows of Velcro. First of all, I marked out where it was to go, and then I added 3 strips just to make sure it was really secure at the back. So first of all, mark out where your Velcro's to go, make sure it's the same on both sides. Add in scores with your knife, open up the scores with a heat gun, and then you can glue on the Velcro. I add glue to the top and then push the Velcro on. It's important to make sure it's flat, especially at the corners. Just obviously be careful when doing this. I continued doing this for the other strips of Velcro. Once I'd finished gluing those, I glue around the Velcro. This stops it peeling up at the corners. So I'm also adding in Velcro along the collar here. I take a Dremel and remove any extra material that's sticking up that will stop it laying flat. I can now mark out a second row of Velcro. So again, I just mark out where the Velcro's going, score it, use a heat gun to open the scores, and then I glue the Velcro on, making sure I glue around the Velcro to stop it coming up. This is a messy process, so don't get down if it looks messy, you won't see it anyway once it's on. You're better having a secure attachment than worrying about it being neat, especially when you don't see it. So on the shoulder armour, I'm obviously wanting to match it up to the top here, so that the Velcro is glued in the correct place. So what I actually do is I push it down onto the Velcro that I've got, and that leaves a little mark of where it should be on the shoulder armour. So I take the loop side of the Velcro, this is the soft side, and I glue those strips of Velcro down. You can see I've already done one side here. Always make sure you go around the Velcro with the hot glue. Next I move to the back and add on the strips of Velcro there. And again I go around it with my hot glue gun. Once you're finished, you'll be left with Velcro at the front and the back. Next, I go back to part S4 and I'm going to glue that on. So this is the part that needs to look like a bit of leather fabric underneath. I add contact cement to the foam part and also a bit onto the leather at the side. I then add contact cement to the underside of the shoulder armour, and once I was happy, I then glued that on. I do think it's beneficial to do this part once you've finished the shoulder armour, because then when you glue it on, it will be in the exact curve that you need. Once finished, it would look like this. As you can see, it pops on and off quite easily. So for the collar, I actually just added some Velcro underneath the top here. It's quite difficult to see, but it's on the inside of the collar part. I glued this on in exactly the same way as I've been doing with the Velcro. I then mark out on the collar where I want the Velcro to join. I add in my scores, open them up with a heat gun, and then hot glue my Velcro on. Now you've completed your main top, and you can move on to another tutorial. Thanks for watching.